Nigel, Scott, welcome to Weird Sauce, and thank you for making time and to have this conversation with us from your location in Australia. Could you kindly introduce yourself for our audience?
Yeah, obviously, my name's Nigel Scott. I have a long history in advertising, marketing, and management consulting. I run a company called Digital Partners. The size of the organisation ebbs and flows with the market cycles, but generally it's about bringing together teams of clever people to solve business problems on an ad hoc demand. Clients over the years have included the major telcos, major government departments like Defence, some of the major banks in Australia like the Commonwealth Bank, projects with Westpac and some of the major insurers as well. I don't think there's an industry sector we haven't touched over the years. We have done work from everybody from mining through to retail, through to manufacturing, through to wholesaling, through to education, and across government as well. So we've touched a lot of points over the years and delivered a wide range of different projects. Essentially solve problems as those problems emerged. That's the quick heads up of who I am and what we do.
And so what led you to do something like this before we dive into what is it exactly that we mean by communication design, quote unquote marketing? So what led you to this line of work?
It essentially goes back to the very, very early days. I left when I left high school. I was studying architecture. I got thrown out of the architecture school here at Curtin University in Perth because I came up with a scam where I was doing all the technical drawing and other people writing essays and doing the mathematics, and we were pulling all the assignments to get through quickly. And obviously the school wasn't too impressed with what we were doing. So anyway, I left architecture, and in that small window, I bought a movie camera and started making movies. And I ended up winning a few awards locally, and then I went back to study media design at Curtin University. And upon graduation, I again won some filmmaking awards. That sent me to Sydney. I ended up working for Film Graphics, which at that stage was the premier film production house, advertising production house in Australia at that stage. I think at that point they were the only company to have won an Academy Award in Australia for a short animated film they did for Bruce Petty. Anyway, they gave me a job, gave me a start. The first TV commercial I worked on was the launch of Kerry Packer's Pajama Cricket, which your English and New Zealand and Australian and Indian listeners would know quite well, was a fairly revolutionary break in traditional cricket moving forward. And after that, I lasted about 18 months making TV commercials. I found in the end it wasn't as exciting as it seemed to be, and came back to Perth and ended up writing a course in media design. The WA Department of Education hired me to set the course up. We ended up building a television studio and a number of other facilities in a brand new building. I think we ended up spending about $5 million on the facility at that stage. And we launched what was effectively Australia's first course in digital media. We put rooms of computers in there, started teaching graphic design on computers, started teaching sound and animation and film editing on computers. And it was fairly cutting edge. We're talking about the late 80s as a time frame. And we did that for about 5 years. Those students went on to work all around the world. Some of them ended up becoming managing directors of major advertising conglomerates throughout Southeast Asia and in Australia itself. Some went on to work in Hollywood and on the major feature films. What happened during that period, because that really frames my ongoing interest in media and the integration of media with information technology and telecoms. I actually wrote a series, because I wrote the course, I wrote the textbooks and the manuals to support the course, and that material ended up being rolled out across the universities and the private schools and the TAFEs around Australia. And the materials were sent off to the UK with anticipation that one of the major publishers were going to publish this material globally as a new generation of media studies. Because essentially what I tried to do here in Perth was create a Bauhaus of media, if that makes sense. Basically a reimagining of how design could be reframed in an age of information technology. Anyway, a number of university professors across England reviewed my material and came back and said, hey, it represented the past of media rather than the future. And at that stage, I'd actually been offered a role to go over to New Zealand to set up a similar course in New Zealand, which ironically enough was in Wellington, which obviously became the gestation point, which became the film industry we now know in New Zealand that created Lord of the Rings and all these other things. And obviously in another life, in another parallel universe, I would have gone there and been involved in that. But the feedback which came from London and Manchester triggered me to find out what they meant by this not being the ideas which I was working on not being the future of media. And essentially they were talking in terms of what we now understand as interactive media, gaming and these sorts of things. Anyway, I used that as a trigger to go and explore new things. And BHP hired me to project manage an e-learning exercise whereby they were closing down the steelworks in Newcastle and Wollongong. And they had a significant number of migrant workers who couldn't read or write English, and they tasked me with designing and rolling out essentially 60 hours worth of online training to teach essentially metal workers and steel workers how to read and write English so they could be reskilled and sent off into other roles in the workplace. And that was the start of what became a deep dive into digital media, which essentially became e-commerce, an awful lot of work within the banking industry, designing banking systems, transactional and sales systems across the banking sector. And led me into projects like fixing Senate reporting inside Defence for the infrastructure group, and then the similar projects inside telcos and stuff. So it became a shift from what we would understand to be film and television into what we now would be calling data sciences and those sorts of things. So it's been a journey. Been a highly experimental journey. There's certainly been a long trend over the years to go somewhere for 5 years, then rip it all up and start again, if only just to see what else could be done in a different way somewhere else. And so that's essentially my background.
That's a very broad and at the same time really key industry, so to speak, because at least correct me if I'm wrong. I hear communication. I hear design to attract attention, to convey a message. I hear framing to some extent. So in this digital world that we're now in, with barely a step left in the real world, considering the amount of time that we spent online, what is your perception of the digital economy, the technology companies are as they're selling it to us via different kind of media? What's your view of this field? Is it awesome? Is it all the hype that it seems they'd like to throw at us? And is it a bright future for humanity, this technology life that we are slowly but certainly moving into?
The transition for me over an expanse of 40 years has been fascinating, in the sense that today anybody can go to a supermarket and pick up a $50 mobile phone, which has significantly more computing power than what I had at hand when I was first making computer-generated TV commercials back in the early 80s. We would spend millions of dollars on computers which would take up rooms and rooms of space. And all they would create is wireframe drawings, which we then have to create photographic lists from, and then colorize them using traditional photographic techniques to create the illusion of computer animated visuals. Obviously today the phone has immense computing power. The visuals are stunning. But having said that, and everybody can do it. I mean, the reality is you can go to TikTok and anybody can become a movie director, and anybody can by chance garnish an audience of a couple of 100,000 views, simply by posting a video, and it miraculously taking hold of the imagination, or the collective imagination. The reality is our ability to create digital simulacra is unprecedented. But at the same time, I think what is of more interest is the hypnotic effect of the media. We've sort of transitioned from the fireplace television set, where the family would sit around and take in stories in the evening, to a 24/7 window into a hyper reality. So if you're not happy with where you are at the moment, you just pick the phone up and it'll take you anywhere you want, simply by going to an app or going to Google and or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, beginning that journey. And so these apps have been elegantly designed. They are the social media stuff I find fascinating, purely in the context of back in the late 90s. I went to a conference in Atlanta, the E3 conference, which is a big gaming conference for the USA. And at that stage, everybody knew that they could get young boys to play video games. The challenge was that girls weren't playing video games. And the people from Mattel and Microsoft, Atari, Sony, Nintendo would sit there on industry panels and wax lyrical about the challenge of getting girls to play with digital Barbie dolls and things like this. The emergence of Facebook was self-evidently a game for girls. And as soon as it appeared, you knew that actually the game for girls looked nothing like the game for boys. But more importantly, once the girls adopted the game, the boys would follow. And so your Instagrams and your TikToks are games for girls. Whether the world sees them as that is, I don't know, but certainly that's the way I would frame our reality today. Is the industry's cracked the code of engaging girls in with the technology, and it's purely this ability to collaborate and communicate and share, which wasn't there in the standard video games, which emerged out of Pong and the sports simulation.
And in your view, having been in the industry for so long, you have a longitudinal perspective. You basically can look in the mirror backwards, and therefore perhaps have a much better understanding of what our future looks like. So this approach to digitalize everything that we do or to escape, in your perspective, is that really an innovation, or is it that the way they're doing this is the innovation? Because it seems these two concepts are bundled together, and hyperbole comes out. And in the field of funding, quote unquote, innovation, we hear a lot of hyperbole. And a lot of the time what we're left with is a seemingly, I'm going to say something controversial, but a seemingly dumb product. So if I put video of cats playing piano online, at least at the origin of this video, it would be successful. Is that the innovation that we signed up for or didn't? But is that the innovation really? Or is this just yet another gigantic marketing sell?
I think the innovation in digital media, and specifically out of Silicon Valley, was its ability to repackage an aging tech stack and call it something new. And essentially it's been doing that for every decade since at least the 1980s. Facebook, when you strip away the marketing hype, essentially is nothing more than a database of friends, and a database of stored media about friends, the photographs, the messages and everything else. Now, if you went to market and said, hey, this is a database where you can put your information and your photos and everything else, then obviously you're not going to attract anybody to that experience because it sounds as dull as dishwater. But to call it social media and to have network effects, but more importantly, to gamify it by saying, hey, you're more important if you have more likes, if you have more followers. It's actually the game which has been created has nothing to do with sharing cat videos. The game that's been created is about measuring your experience and your purpose and your worth. So essentially what these social media platforms, and more importantly Silicon Valley in its unique way of repackaging this stuff, whether it's at the board of director level with their KPI dashboards, or whether it's for 13-year-old teenagers with TikTok. And essentially what we've done is use the technology to create a dashboard for life. And this dashboard allows us to measure our purpose as a human being within the context of a digital society. Now, what that means is increasingly the digital simulacra is more important than the reality outside. So if you think of, let's say, school sports, today a parent is more likely to watch their child running a race through their phone because they're busy at work than what they would be to turn up and stand at the racetrack and cheer and be engaged with their child doing that circuit. And so what we've actually done is augmented our ability to, that tactile ability to actually be engaged with one another as a community. Years ago, when I was running the Excavate blog, one of the questions we explored is exactly what has Facebook disrupted. And we sifted through an awful lot of data to answer that question. But in the end, it became self-evident that what Facebook had disrupted was community. You know, the things which have been disrupted was things like church attendance and people gathering in sporting clubs and communities. If you walk around Australia today and you did that in the 70s, you would find that the bowling clubs and the cricket clubs and the football clubs, people would be out and these would be the hives of activity. Today, it's very hard to get new members to get out there and physically exercise and engage in these activities because it's far too easy to engage with one another over the mobile phone. More importantly, if you don't find the community locally, you can engage with somebody who's in Italy or in London or in LA or New York or Rio de Janeiro. And so we've become a society of pen pals, digital pen pals. Obviously, it's a much more richer experience than just writing those letters. But essentially, this is what we've created, is a substitute for being there, if that makes sense.
It does. It's a tragedy to some extent as a title. I mean, a substitute for being there, if you think about what that implies. So another question that comes to mind as well is then, is there any competition? Is there any parallel system to these massive tech company now of perhaps the equivalent of sustainable farming for agriculture? Is there a sustainable tech somewhere where you're not being mined, you're not the product, your personal and human experience is not debased? Is there such an ecosystem in your view?
The key to understanding these ecosystems is to try and map the relationship of where they've come from and how they've evolved. I mean, the Facebook story is perhaps the most popular and well known. Perhaps what's less well known is the fact that Mark Zuckerberg appeared on national television, or at least the business press, within weeks of writing his first line of code. And if you understand that in context, it's almost like this boy was the chosen one, because you don't get that amount of coverage 2 weeks into a startup unless you've got something going for you. And it was also an interesting time that Facebook emerged at that point where Rupert Murdoch had just bought into MySpace. And at that time, MySpace was going to be the Facebook. But the fact was an Australian businessman had bought into this property, and obviously Rupert Murdoch was heavily associated with traditional media, whether it was printed or electronic. And so this competitor emerged out of Harvard, which became the ultimate game changer. And the narrative changed significantly. And this is an important part of understanding how these tech stories emerge. If you look at all the so-called viral apps, they didn't emerge by osmosis. They emerged by significant, and I'm talking about hugely significant investment in public relations by the very VC companies that funded their development. In fact, I would describe Silicon Valley's venture capital culture more as a public relations network as opposed to an investment network. If you actually look at their investment returns, very few of them actually manage to beat the market index. And if they do, they tend to beat it when the Fed's printing an awful lot of money. and so their ability to generate outsized returns is very cyclical. And so the reality is the ecosystem from which these things emerge is very much self-serving. They emerge in the universities across the US. They emerge out, whether it's Google or Facebook, they essentially emerge out of the R&D environments which exist in those universities. The products are tested on the students first, and then they're handed over to VCs. But the VCs not only get first bite at this emerging product, they also obviously have the university's funds to deploy. And the VCs also invest heavily in media companies. So you have this virtuous circle of academics and student money and university money all converging at this one point to create this explosion of new media, which has come to dominate the last 20 years last 25 years, to be honest. And essentially, if you want to know why hard science isn't funded anymore, it's simply because if you're going to fund what university students are interested in at that point in their lives, it's more likely to be about relationships and front of mind, essentially connecting with other students and involving in communication at a very deep and personal level as they emerge and move forward in their lives. So you're not going to get people who are interested in solving cancer, because the reality is the bulk of the population has that problem actually are much older than 20-year-old university students. Universities, what's front of mind for university students is actually making those connections which will move forward for the rest of their lives, whether they're business networking, so you get business networking apps, you get social media, which essentially is, if you used to meet your life partner in church before, now you meet them on social media like Facebook. Intellectual connections and so forth are made on things like Twitter. Business connections are made on LinkedIn. So essentially what you have is these databases of connections which have emerged to service university students as they move forward in their lives, which essentially means we've seen a cycle of that. The next generation will create new experiences around the same premise. And so what you're seeing is an innovation cycle which essentially is revisiting itself on a, let's say, a 7 to 15 year basis, as those new generation of students emerge who look forward and say, well, that's how they used to do it. We're going to do things slightly different, but in reality, it's pretty much the same. It's just the technology's evolved, it's smaller, it's more at hand, and it's a far richer graphical user interface. Obviously, the next generation of stuff to emerge will be augmented reality and virtual reality. It may or may not have an element of crypto in there. It's basically relabeling the past and presenting as bright, shiny, and new for the future. Having said that,
sounds like a washing machine with a different name.
Yeah, it is, because it's like any. If you think of it as a factory, then obviously it's a lot easier just to rebrand something and present it as bright, shiny, and new, and what it is to actually create a brand new product line, which involves a significant amount of R&D and everything else.
And so what's your view of competing product and bracket competing country in that same ecosystem? So, for example, what is the state of China? What is the state of perhaps Latin America, other countries apart from the United States? Are there big players out there? You gave the example of TikTok, but it seems like even these big players are still playing in the same field. or do we have a sideline ecosystem that is growing in other countries with perhaps a different approach or a different model?
I think, well, obviously, they say China's in the business of replication, but the reality is, if you look at the history of interactive gaming and digital media, it's actually Japan who led the field. About the time of the dot-com crash, Japan had already moved, or was in the process of moving, to the mobile experience, the avatars and the e-com, the mobile commerce, the buying of and the networks, the social media. These were already part of the Japanese digital ecosystem. Essentially, the US were late to the market on that experience, essentially because there was a bit of a chasm after the dot-com crash. Obviously, the iPhone came out and the US has moved ahead. Today, you would possibly be in a position to say that China is actually defining what that digital future looks like, simply because they're experimenting. A lot of the business model, the reason they have an advantage is if you look at the history of digital, if you arrive late, you've actually had a significant advantage moving forward, because you don't. Anybody who's ever worked with an enterprise system knows that the biggest challenge moving forward is actually what they've been using in the past. So your old databases, your old computers, your old operating systems, your old applications, somehow you have to magically move those forward into the new experience, which is mobile or smart wearables or virtual reality moving forward. But that legacy is still an anchor holding you back. If you come late, you don't have that legacy holding you back. You can just jump into the next wave and comfortably ride it moving forward. So there is no reason for any country to be left behind in relation to this shift to being digital. In some ways, arriving late is actually a competitive advantage. The trick is how experimental you are with the environment and what you're trying to achieve with it. Arguably, if you look at the last 40 years, the most interesting things that have happened in the digital space have actually appeared in film and television. The idea of doing a Game of Thrones or the Avengers series back in the 80s would have been a pipe dream, because the cost and the effort to actually create those effects would have just been cost prohibitive, because you had to do it all with physical 3D models and so forth. Obviously, the stuff we do today is so radically advanced compared to those times. And that's only going to keep moving forward, because essentially it's the artistic community which drive innovation in that space. And unlike, say the enterprise space, where essentially the programmers dictate the usability and the terms of the systems which are in place, and it's always a question of what can you do for us, and the answer is not much. In the artistic space, it's the artists push those windows, and they're constantly pushing those windows so far, and the programmers who are engaged and involved are there for the ride. And so the art space is moving at this speed, and the corporate space is moving at this speed. And obviously, a lot more money's made in that corporate space than what it is on that bleeding edge in the artistic space. But the interesting things are happening. The barriers, the windows. The reason you can have special effects in your TikToks is because all that R&D over the last 40 years, which has happened in the film and TV space, which has demanded those kind of effects and driven the price down to the point where everybody can afford to do it.
And what are your views on digital innovation in healthcare? So I was reminded yesterday and today that the Theranos trial is beginning in the United States. Elizabeth Holmes is going to be trialed for this healthcare equivalent of WeWork, I suppose, or thereabout. What are your views on the quote innovation in the healthcare space that we were being sold on at so many levels, where wearable devices, genetics, testing, all this kind of stuff that seems bundled in, and at the same time, the existence of something as Theranos, which is absorbed such scale of money to essentially produce nothing apart from a Ponzi scheme, as far as I could see it. But maybe I get this totally wrong. So, what are your views on those mega healthcare tech mutations, so to speak, to use a popular word right now?
The healthcare sector is an interesting space. I mean, 20 years ago, it was probably more than that now, 25 years ago, we did an R&D project with one of the telcos here in Australia, which was about creating an artificial intelligent medical general practice assistant. Essentially, it was to use technology to augment the general practitioner's ability to do diagnosis and figure out what the drugs were. Now we built this thing and we began trialing this thing, and it's essentially the reason it didn't work was because the medical association decided that the last thing the GP needed was a computer on his desk, because essentially that would break the bond between the patient and the general practitioner. And that is an interesting story in the context. If you go back even further, a decade earlier in the 90s, we'd been involved with one of the Japanese manufacturers to try and launch video phones. And they built these things and they tried to roll them out in Japan, and people wouldn't let them into their house because they didn't want unwelcome strangers in their homes. Fast forward 30 years, and obviously that seems like a cultural divide which is nonsensical, and the current generation in Japan would struggle to comprehend how their grandparents and their parents would think like that. I suspect moving forward, the Dr. Googles and the AIs will become increasingly more part of the tool set, not only of the profession but also of the patient. The problem digital has is when it hits the real world, is the very things that make it look efficient and so rewarding in the simulated world of digital, more often than not, don't translate into the real world. And the reason that is, I suspect, because largely the reality of digital can be simulated so readily. So even on the social media platforms, and you may remember the experiment we ran years ago, where we ran an experiment which allowed us to document the amount of machine traffic versus real people on Twitter. Now, we found that was anywhere between 7 to 15 to 1. So for every one human being who was contributing to that platform, there was about 15 bots or machine-type components which are amplifying that experience. And we found similar things inside all of the major advertising platforms as well. Now, obviously, in that digital experience where what you're looking for is, hey, I've got my dashboard, I'm looking for my likes and I'm looking for my shares and everything else, that simulation is actually a positive reinforcement of playing the game of digital. You try and move that outside of that realm and suddenly it starts to break down. And that may or may not be what happened with the Thanos story. But essentially, we see similar stories coming out of using artificial intelligence to do analytics on things like X-rays of lung cancers and so forth. This thing comes much harder in that space. We see it with self-driving cars and things like that. Taking things out of its digital environment and then putting it in the real world has its challenges, and those challenges are because the things which allow you to gamify the digital experience don't readily translate into the real world experience, if that makes sense. I'm not sure I even got near to answering your question, to be honest.
Yeah, I want to press on just a little bit about these two things, these two companies like WeWork and Theranos as an example of something so big at a scale so unfathomable for most of us, and yet one struggles to find out where was the innovation, or was it just packaging? Was it just like a big old communication event that
Well,
really
it's the appetite for innovation is innovation in the American context is like sugar. And if you go back to the .com period, you'll see your WorldComs, you'll see your Enrons. You'll see that essentially, most people forget that at the height of the .com experience, it also paralleled the year 2K pandemic, which essentially was the clock ticked over and the world failed. Today we're seeing a similar mirror of convergence of events. Obviously, the pandemic isn't digital; it's external. But essentially, share prices are going through the roof at the same time that this so-called world-ending experience is happening simultaneously. And so you've got this kind of parallel universe where the stock market's kind of here and the rest of the world should be thinking, hey, Armageddon's around the corner, what's going to happen next? In both cases, the key to the sugar was the amount of money that Fed was printing to try and keep the economies, or the US economy, alive. And that just created this massive feedback loop. And we're seeing it again. Eventually, the money supply stops and everything, and the chairs and the music stop, and suddenly we discover there was 3 chairs for 20 dancers, and things revert back to normal for a time. But essentially, the reason the WeWorks and so forth eventuate is simply because the market itself wants to believe that there's a future beyond where there is a brave new world. And tech tends to feed that by repackaging the old and saying, look, here it is, it's different. So whereby before you had a database, now you've got blockchain, which is a database, but it's a different sort of database. So therefore you've got to trash all your databases and go to this thing because it's, hey, databases on steroids. Does things other databases don't do. Once you start peeling away at those narratives, you suddenly discover there's not really a great deal to them, and they're a terrific amount of marketing. I mean, network effects was essentially came out, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s as a way of selling Ethernet. It wasn't science. It was the same sort of junk science which over the years has sold diets and sold things like the scorecards by which you frame the characteristics of talent as you put it into an organisation. They're amazing pieces of and Taylorism. I mean, it goes all the way back to Ford and the emergence of Taylorism. All of this is based on junk data and junk science. But the reality is the marketplace has an appetite because it has a need to believe that beyond today, there's something more exciting tomorrow. And so feeding that appetite for change, feeding that appetite for growth is actually fairly simple, so long as you're prepared to concoct a story which, at first glance, feels like it belongs and feels like it offers a future. And reality is today there's that many channels on which to distribute it. It's probably never been easier. The challenge, the big difference over 40 years has been simply this. Back in the 80s, the hard part was actually coming up with a creative message. Today is actually finding an audience. So the whole media paradigm has shifted on 180 degrees. It's a different world.
Talking about different world, so tell me about how this pandemic has treated you, or how you've treated the pandemic and your personal navigation through that.
When news of it first emerged, I dug through the data. I did what came naturally to me, and that was okay, this is the narrative. How is the narrative constructed? Does the data support the narrative? And I went through that process. My assumption was the narrative was constructed simply because the health system didn't have the breadth to cope, no matter how small a problem was. And so I started creating models basically to figure out how little it would take to break the hospital systems. Because at the end of the day, the hospital systems had suffered from the pandemic of managerialism, which has struck not only the hospitals but also defence forces and banking and insurance and virtually anybody else in the game. We choose to manage what we can measure, but we don't tend to think too hard about what we're actually measuring in the first place. And so essentially, by applying the wrong metrics, we've limited our ability to respond to those challenges. In the context of Australia, New Zealand, with them being islands, in reality, that there shouldn't have been that much of a challenge. Anybody would have read their history books that have said, well, all we really need to do is isolate people coming into the country to determine whether they're safe, and then once you know they're safe, then you let them in. Obviously, for whatever reason, the powers to be that are in charge of those processes failed to design processes or adopt processes which allowed that to happen in a consistent way. And once you fail to manage those kind of problems proactively, essentially you're on the road to chaos, which obviously is what we're seeing on the east coast of Australia today. I'm reluctant to talk about the numbers in terms of how big a problem this is, because there's obviously specialists who do this for a living. I deconstruct narratives because I find it useful to help me understand how to construct narratives. And so I'm not going to say, hey, yay or nay in terms of, the reality was almost globally the policymakers lost control of the narrative early. And once you do that, then the narrative drives you. You become responsive to, and increasingly with the technology and the landscape we have today, that becomes, it goes beyond herding cats. The narrative becomes emergent in its own right, if that makes sense. And trying to put all that back into a bag and contain it is mission impossible. The only way you're going to address that moving forward is to essentially come up with a brand new narrative and a brand new game which everybody has to play. but I'm not sure there's that many clever people in the room to either recognise that that's the challenge they're facing, or B, even if they did, they're capable of sitting around the table and coming up with a narrative which is consistent enough to get the world on board to move forward. So yeah, it's an interest. In many ways, the pandemic today mirrors the year 2K pandemic, and that was very much about follow the money. If you follow the money, then you understand how the narrative emerged and who is making the money out of the arbitrage which the narrative creates. And that's where the real story is. And whether we have journalists clever enough today to go looking for that, then I'm not sure. Whether the story needs to be told, I suspect it may be told in future times, but we'll see what happens. Yeah.
And the situation for yourself, did you at the very beginning, obviously you're equipped with the ability to understand what the narrative is, the ability to pull data, the ability to do model. A lot of people are not equipped with that, even though the story was in a different realm perhaps than media. At any point, were you kind of frightened of the face of it, just for what was being thrown out in the media, the lockdown, the apocalyptic sort of ecosystem that was being repeated? Were you scared for yourself? And so how was that journey for you of understanding, having some toolkit that could help you navigate these things? And how much of a difference do you think that made to your peace of mind, or to ensuring that you would stay healthy through a pandemic?
Well, again, being in Australia, you have a significant advantage because the place is so isolated. And worst case scenario, you just get in your car and you isolate even further away from anybody else. So for much of the pandemic last year, we just spent days walking up and down the beach, enjoying the whales and watching the dolphins play. So our experience compared to the rest of the world was very different, essentially because we could manage that experience. The experience I have of the pandemic is very much a digital experience. And so it's really just been about deconstructing narratives and cross-referencing narratives to basically map how the pandemic narrative has become an emergent narrative, and the conflicting stories and the conflicting messages. So yeah, it's become very much, I would describe, an academic exercise. From a business perspective, obviously it's limited my ability to get on a plane and go to London and go to Hong Kong and all the places I would normally go to, and that has been exceptionally frustrating. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. So you work within the parameters and the limitations that's been set. That's the rules of the game, and if you're going to play the game, you play by those rules.
And do you, being in Australia, so we've seen some pretty scary media report of having police out there, people being beaten, and it's not just in Australia. We've seen those scenes in other countries where people are just facing another round of narrative or another round of lockdown, and another round of measures that are followed by other measures that we're told were never going to happen. How do you think that this is doing? What do you think it's doing to the social construct or social community understanding of people living together, and whether they can trust the society in which they are, and then also they have some free will, they have some freedom, at least in the Western democracy?
Yeah, I think, Australia is fairly unique. The images that you're seeing, if you understand the history of Australia, wouldn't come as any surprise. The only people it would surprise are the people who don't understand the country's history, and in particular reference its history to its Aboriginal people, its history to its immigrants. And as much as it's been an immigrant nation now for a couple of 100 years, the reality is the immigration passage of right, where it was with the original convicts or where it was through the Europeans and now the Asians and the Africans who are arriving in this nation. Essentially, if you were to put it delicately, it would be you're beaten into shape. You're beaten into understanding what it is to be an Australian. Sport being central to that experience. Australians, the myth of Australia is obviously the Crocodile Dundee movie. Australians themselves are very, very conformist. They will take the road most travelled, i.e. the road of least resistance. And essentially I think that comes back to the origins of the country, the convict, the settlement. To understand Australia, I would say go and read that 1950s classic, The Lucky Country. You wouldn't need to read any other book and you'd probably understand the country fairly well. So it doesn't come as a huge surprise, the response, the government response, the chaos, and but at the same time, there's always going to be a group within the country who struggle to comply. But that rich history has always been there. You have Ned Kelly, you have the Eureka Stockade. Of course, all those histories are tragic in their outcome for those who disagree with the mainstream. But again, that's the history of the country. So the country itself, in its response, is reverting to norm. Likewise, the lockdowns and the lockdowns, particularly in the West, are representational of the country's great fear of what lies north of it. Again, it's probably not much discussed, but politically, historically, there's always been a great fear within the nation of what happens if what lies north of us chooses to come down. And so the lockdown and the hope that the problem will just sail past is very much of that cultural fit of, hey, Australia in many ways is a country afraid of its future. If it wasn't, then Western Australia would look like California. We would have built pipelines from the north where all the water is, and we would have irrigated the deserts to the south and to the east, and the country would have blossomed. But instead, essentially, we live as tourists. We dig holes in the ground and we build big houses. But do we have a vision for what this country is moving forward? In the sense that the US has a vision for what that country's place in the world is, in the sense that China has a vision for its place in the world, in the sense that Hong Kong and Singapore have visions for where their place in the world, and in Indonesia as well. Does Australia have that unifying vision of who we are in the world, other than beyond putting sporting teams out there, which occasionally win cricket matches or Olympic medals? Arguably not. Arguably not.
Well, Nigel, to conclude this conversation, which I thoroughly enjoyed, I'm reminded of every time we speak how much I need to learn from you and how much you have to offer in terms of education, at least for someone like me. I would like to ask you to share with our audience what your weird sauce for life is.
My weird sauce is two things. One, I believe life is infinitely experimental, and I think that it's important to keep coming up with new challenges and continually ask why, and not just the first level of the why, but those questions of 4 to 5 levels deep. And so I continually create experiments for myself, or when I'm contracted by my clients, essentially they're similar journeys. How did you get here? Who's been affected by it? And then we start talking about the changes that need to happen to move forward from that point. The other weird source, which is probably not that weird, and that is, I think it's important to choose the right life partner. And in my life, I've been very lucky with that. My wife, Sue, has supported this chaotic journey which we've undertaken over the decades to keep exploring new things. It's almost like a Star Trek concept, to boldly go where you haven't gone before. It's too easy to stop and let inertia take you over. Life's a journey. Keep moving. Sometimes you'll run, sometimes you'll walk because you're exhausted, but hey, don't just sit still and watch it go past you. That would be my message. And one other thing, and that is, wherever possible, excite the others you meet to go on that journey. The most exciting conversations I have now at my age is when I come across my old students and my old work colleagues, and they say, hey, I went on to work on a Batman film, or I went to work in an ad agency and I became the MD. And inevitably they point back and say, I wouldn't have been there if you hadn't have got me excited enough to take that journey. And that's great. I mean, what better way of saying, hey, it was worth the effort than to have people say, hey, I went there because I was inspired to go there, and you helped ignite that passion. So yeah. Hopefully that's an answer which makes sense.
It certainly does. Nigel, Scott, and Sue, who's the invisible partner here, and obviously you brought us this wonderful conversation by osmosis to some extent. Thank you again for your time. Wonderful conversation, and we wish you all the best.
Yeah, thanks for the chance to speak. It's been great.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest, and stay curious about life.